have to go out.
All right, here we go. So today we are talking about the question, why do the Gospels have different stories about Jesus' life? So we all know that we've got 4 Gospels in our New Testament. And an assumption that I bring with me when I think about a question like this is that there's got to be a reason for that. Especially in the early church and the early Middle Ages, it was incredibly difficult to find places to write things down. First, it was papyrus, which was pretty cheap, but disintegrated easily. If it got wet, it would be a mess. And then they switched over to vellum parchment, and then that was very, very expensive. It was much more long term, but to have to stretch an animal skin to create your paper, basically, it was quite an extensive process, very, very expensive process. And so to find value in writing down not just one version of the story of Jesus' life, but 4 of them, and maintaining those throughout time, I think is a very intentional choice. So why do we have all of these different Gospels, and why are there some differences among them? So as we get started, I want to think a little bit too about even how many Gospels we have in the Bible. My personal protocol is that when I am talking about the gospel, as in the content of the message of the good news of Jesus Christ, I use a lowercase g. And when I am talking about one of the collection of the writings about the life of Jesus that appear in our Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as we know them today, I use a capital G gospel. Because the formal books of the Bible that we call Gospels are not the only place where we find the gospel in the Bible. We all know that, of course. I would say that the whole Bible, of course, is a source of good news about God for us. But then if we kind of define it a little bit more narrowly and ask the question about Gospels in the Bible that specifically refer to Jesus, then we still have more than 4, because we have, for example, places like 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where Paul tells us what the content of his gospel is. So I'm going to read to you from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 5. For I handed on to you as of first importance that what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. And so this is the core for Paul of the gospel. This is the good news. And he's got these 2 main acts of Jesus, and then there are kind of proving verbs. So the 2 main verbs are died and was raised. And then in order to prove that he died, we say that he was buried. In order to prove that he was raised, we say that he appeared to people and showed them that he was alive again. And this is Paul's gospel. This is the basics of the message that Paul shared when he would travel around. Now, this doesn't mean that Paul didn't talk about any other aspects of Jesus' life or share any other parts of what he knew of who Jesus was and what was going on in his life, because we have to remember that Paul was not interested in writing a systematic, complete history of the life of Jesus. He was writing letters to people who he already had a relationship with. And so we can assume that he said more than he said in his letters when he talked to them in person, but we have no evidence for what that would have been. So what we do know, according to Paul, from what he writes in his letters, is that Jesus was born of woman. He was Jewish. Paul says he was born under the law. He was betrayed. He had a last meal with his disciples. He was crucified and died, and then he rose again. So that's what we know about Jesus from Paul. So pretty simplistic, pretty condensed understanding and version of the gospel from Paul. And then we kind of see a progression historically within the idea of what's important for the gospel. And I want to share with you a couple of different historical progressions that I think are important to understand why we ended up with expanded understandings of what the gospel is and needs to cover. So first, we have the historical progression of the identity of a Christian. The earliest Christians were Jews who lived in Palestine, the people who were, knew Jesus, who were in the same region as Jesus in his ministry. And so these are people in a very particular place in the backwater of the Roman Empire. No power, no citizenship for the most part, just kind of stuck in the corner. Then as time went on, the message started to spread out from the Palestinian Jews into the diaspora of Judaism a little bit. So then you start to get Hellenistic Jews, and Hellenistic just means Greek, enculturated into Greek culture to some degree. So people who are ethnically Jewish, maybe religiously practice at least some levels of Judaism, but are also integrated into the larger Greek culture. And then from there, it expands out into Hellenistic Gentiles. So people who are not Jewish, who, for example, meet Paul and start to develop this relationship with Jesus. It's interesting because it only takes about 40 years from the death and resurrection of Jesus until this primarily Jewish phenomenon became almost an entirely Gentile movement. It transitioned very quickly from this kind of Jewish sect into something that was disconnected from Judaism, at least in terms of who adhered to it, who was interested in it. And I think that there's a good reason for that, because if we say that Jesus died and was raised approximately, the year 30-ish, 33-ish, then 40 years after that, in the year 70, was when a Jewish uprising occurred, and the Romans came in, and in order to squash the uprising, they destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. And then the persecution of Jews really picked up quite a bit. And so when Christians saw that Jews were being persecuted and were no longer acceptable in the eyes of the Roman Empire, it would make sense for them to say, oh, no, we don't have any Jewish connections. We're not connected with them. You don't need to persecute us. We're doing something completely different over here. Look, we're not even Jewish. All of us are Gentiles. All of us are Greeks. We have our foundations in Judaism, but we've pushed all of that aside. And so the idea that Christians proclaim the Jewish Messiah that Jews do not proclaim becomes kind of goes from being something that is a problem, something that is difficult to explain, something that is a consideration that needs to be addressed, into no longer being an issue. Well, the Jews rejected him, and so now we're moving on to somebody else, and so we'll just kind of let that lie. So that's one historical progression. Another historical progression that is important when we're thinking about the Gospels is, and we talked a little bit about this when we were talking about, did we talk about it last week or the week before with the resurrection of the body? I guess
2 weeks, I think.
Was that
2 weeks ago, I think.
So we talked about the parousia, the end of the world, the day of the Lord. And we talked about how the first Christians, people who wouldn't, have used that word, but the first followers of Jesus after he ascended, thought that the end of the world was imminent, that at any moment Jesus was going to return. And so the focus, the priorities are different than if you don't have that kind of belief. It's really important to quickly spread the message. So we don't need to get bogged down in the details. We just need the basics, which we see, for example, in Paul. We don't have a huge explanation of Jesus' life and where he comes from and all these kinds of things. It's just the basic, most important stuff. He died and was buried, and he was raised, and he appeared to people. That's all you need to know about Jesus. That's the bare bones for you to understand what's important about this and why this is a huge break from anything else that has ever happened in history. And then why, Jesus has authority in your life, and then you should start to be interested in his teachings and how to live according to his law. But as time went on, it became less obvious that the end was near. And then people started to wonder about the beginning. Where does this stuff come from? Protology is the word that we use there. The beginnings of this. As the parousia, as the end of the world, the day of the Lord was delayed, now we need to kind of control the message a little bit more, because if time is going to go on, we don't want the message to spread so quickly that it gets modified away from what we believe as the leaders of this movement is the important and correct understanding of all of this. And so over time, people start to ask questions about the beginnings, about protology. And you can even see this occurring. Where does the beginning start in these various gospels? For Paul, as we said, Jesus' death is the beginning of the gospel. But then when we look at the Gospel of Mark, his gospel starts with the baptism of Jesus. Matthew starts with the birth of Jesus. Luke starts with the birth of John the Baptist, the person who proclaims that Jesus is on his way. And then John goes all the way back to the very beginning. The beginning is the beginning, the capital B beginning of all, time and space and creation. And so as time goes on, we can see this kind of slow backing up from what is critical. What's critical is the death and resurrection of Jesus, and how that points to the inbreaking of God into our world and changes everything, to starting to ask questions about the beginnings, about the foundations, about where we come from. How did we get to this place? And so I think those two historical progressions, from Jew to Gentile and from eschatology to protology, are really important for us to keep in mind as we think about the four gospels and kind of where they come from and why they have slight modifications. So any questions or comments on any of that before we hop into the core of what we're going to talk about today? Okay. So the first thing that we need to know about studying the Gospels is that scholars do not agree about how they were formed and how they interact with one another, or how the authors interacted with one another or did not interact with one another. And the process of studying these questions of, did this author know this author's work, or where in what order were these gospels developed, and these kinds of things. This is called source criticism. So we're trying to find the source of their information that these gospel writers used to write their gospels. So the most widely accepted of these source criticism hypotheses, and they are hypotheses, they're theories. You cannot definitively prove any of this because we have no historical record for this. And of course, we don't have the authors themselves to ask. And so we just kind of come up with these theories. Where do these theories come from? Well, we read the Gospels themselves, and we try to deduce things from that reading. And so that's why we can only call these hypotheses. So the hypothesis that is most widely accepted today is called the four-source hypothesis. And it's related only to what we call the synoptic gospels. The synoptic gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John is excluded. And we'll see later that John is a completely different animal, but that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have much more in common with one another. And so the interest of how these three relate to one another is much more much heavier among scholars, because they have things in common, but they also have areas where things are not the same. And so according to the four-source hypothesis is that there are four sources of information for these gospels. The first source is the Mark source. The Mark source is not the gospel itself, the Gospel of Mark itself. The Mark source is information that Mark, the author Mark, gathered together to write his gospel. And so many scholars believe, and we'll talk about this again when we get to actually talking about the different authors and the different gospels, but many scholars believe that Mark was the first, maybe, or at least among the first writers to think, gosh, I should take all of these different traditions about Jesus, all of these different sayings of Jesus that are floating around either orally or written down, and I should put them all together into one coherent narrative about the life of Jesus. And so Mark's source material, the capital M-A-R-K, Mark source, is very likely to be traditions that he's heard about in his community, little tidbits of Jesus's sayings and stories about Jesus's life that were floating around out there, either written or oral, that he brought together to create his gospel. So that's what the Mark source is. And then from the Mark source, scholars say, comes then both Matthew and Luke. So Mark has a lot of information in it, a lot of stories, a lot of even sentences that are close to, if not completely repeated word for word verbatim in either Matthew or Luke or both. And so this hypothesis is that Mark came first, and that when Matthew and Luke wanted to write their gospels, they actually had the Gospel of Mark in their hands as a document that they could use to refer to as they were putting their gospel together. But when you look at the differences and similarities between Luke and Matthew, there are other places where Matthew and Luke agree that they did not get from Mark. There's some other source that they must have had, that they both had, that they were pulling from, that was not Mark. And so scholars call this the Q source. And Q is short for Quelle, which is the German word for source. So it just is the source. Now, the Q source, we don't have it. We don't know, it's kind of a theoretical source. But it represents all of the other shared material that Matthew and Luke share together, but they did not get from Mark. And most of it is like sayings of Jesus. Most of it is not actual stories about Jesus' life, but is sayings of Jesus, quotations from Jesus. So they think maybe Q was like a collection of Jesus's sayings that were maybe written down, or Q could be several different sources. We just represent whatever that is, but with the letter Q when we talk about this. And so there are these two sources, Mark and Q, that then are used by Matthew and Luke to form their gospels. But Matthew and Luke also have their own sources that are independent of each other, that are not found in Mark, not found in Q, that they pull into. And so that's where we get our four sources. So we have the Mark source that turns into Mark's gospel. We have the Q source that we don't have any access to historically, but that we theorize existed either as one written text or several written texts. And then those two pieces were on the table when Matthew wrote his gospel, along with any materials he independently had. And then Luke, the same, had Mark, Q, and then his own Luke materials that he used. So we've got these four different sources. The important thing with the four source hypothesis is that Matthew and Luke did not know of each other. They never saw each other's writings. And that's important, I think, because when we compare these three gospels in what we have today, we can see that Matthew and Luke don't begin to agree with each other in terms of the content of their story until they agree with Mark. So we talked a little bit before about how Mark starts his gospel with the baptism of Jesus, and Matthew and Luke both have nativity narratives. But their nativity narratives are completely different from one another. And that would be a really great, I think, question for us to cover on our very last session before we break for Christmas, if we'd like to do that, to talk about the two different gospel narratives, because there is very little in either of those narratives that matches up in terms of the plot of the story. It isn't until we get to the baptism of Jesus that they then have the Mark source for, that they start to agree with the plot of the narrative. And then same thing with the end of the story. The way that the story wraps up is very different. And that's possibly because Mark didn't provide any end of the story, which we'll talk more about later. And so this hypothesis answers the question of why there are so many contradictions between Matthew and Luke, because they didn't have the same source material as each other. They had different sayings of Jesus, different traditions about Jesus's life that they were drawing from. And then they just so happened both to have this Mark source and this Q source or sources that they also were drawing from. They both had those, but they also had other things that they were pulling in. And so they weren't intentionally contradicting each other. They just had different information that they were working with as they wrote. So that kind of makes this source, this hypothesis helpful to answer that question, to address that issue. So what questions do you have about this? I know this is kind of confusing, but it's helpful.
Katie, when did Matthew and Luke live? Like, were they born when, were they around to follow Jesus, or no? Were they born after?
No.
How far?
So we'll talk about this when we get to talking about each one individually, but the Gospel of Matthew was written probably somewhere between 80 and 90 AD. And Luke was probably written somewhere around 95 AD.
Okay.
So if they were alive when Jesus was around and like old enough to follow him, estimate that they were, like 20 years old. Then by the time they were writing, they were 80, 90, 100 years old.
Right. Memories aren't so good then.
Any other questions? And you'll see why this is important after we have something to compare it to here. I know this is new.
So the source materials, were they written or just oral?
Some of them were probably written down, some of them were probably oral. The Q source that we kind of theorize as a collection of various sources, within this hypothesis, it needs to have at least some written source, because there are places in Matthew and Luke where they are sharing a story or a saying of Jesus, and it's almost word for word the same between the two of them. But they did not get it from Mark's gospel. And so there has to be something written down that they copied from in order to have it be almost word for word the same. But then there are other places where the material, the ideas or the concept or the general story is present in multiple places, but the way that they tell the story is very different. And so that could have just been like an oral thing that they had heard about that they included with their own, telling the story in their own words. So it's very likely a mixture of oral tradition and written tradition that they compiled together to create their gospels.
Okay.
And how did they know that Matthew and Luke didn't know each other?
This is the hypothesis. Because there is content in Matthew and content in Luke that differs from each other and even contradicts each other, this hypothesis suggests that they were not aware of each other's writing. That's why those contradictions exist. But I'm going to share with you another hypothesis where they did know each other, and then we can kind of compare the two.
Oh, okay.
Okay. The pros and cons of accepting that hypothesis.
Okay.
So let me share this one with you. So this one's called the Farrer hypothesis. It's named after a man named Austin Farrer, who came up with it in 1955. And it's different from the first one. So the four-source hypothesis, very important, Mark in priority. Mark came first. And that Matthew and Luke did not know each other. And then we have this hypothetical Q that we have not, we've never seen any historical evidence of Q, but in order for the four-source hypothesis to work, you have to have Q, because like I said, there are materials in Matthew and Luke that they share that do not come from Mark. So where did they get that? They had to have gotten it from somewhere, because if they didn't know each other, then they had to get it from another source. So that's why Q is required for that one. But Farrer says, no, this whole Q thing is tentative at best, because it's mostly sayings of Jesus, like I said, and there's no historical evidence that such a writing ever existed, that there was a book that was running around of the sayings of Jesus that people, used. And so he had a huge problem with this, especially because, like I said before, when we look at Paul, the core of the early church's message about the death and resurrection of Jesus is completely missing when you try to kind of recreate what Q may have looked like. So what you do is you take Matthew and Luke, you break them up into verses or sentences, you figure out which of those verses and sentences came from Mark, and then you can get rid of those. Then you figure out which ones only appear in Matthew, get rid of those. Which ones only appear in Luke, get rid of those. Everything that's left is what Matthew and Luke share that did not appear in Mark. That is Q. And of course, you can't assume that that's all of Q. Maybe, both of them didn't choose some of the same things out of their source material Q. But when you look at that, it's mostly sayings of Jesus, and there's nothing in there about the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so according to Farrer, it doesn't make any sense that Q would have existed, because sayings of Jesus were not priority for the early church. Like I said, it was about that core message. So why would somebody write that down? And there's no historical evidence of such a writing. If the sayings of Jesus were popular enough to appear both in the library of Matthew and Luke, who lived in completely different places. Why don't we have a copy of this somewhere? Why haven't we found at least one that survived? And so he says, no, this hypothesis doesn't work. I'm coming up with something completely different. And so for Farrer, he says that Mark came first, so there's still Mark in priority. Then Matthew used Mark to write his gospel, so he expanded from Mark to form his gospel. And then Luke took both Mark and Matthew and created his gospel and some additional sources of his own to add to it. So this is Farrer's hypothesis, that Mark was still first, but that Mark led to Matthew, and then Matthew and Mark together led to Luke. So Luke was aware of Matthew's gospel. So this is helpful in terms of answering those questions that Farrer raised about, why would Q omit the important stuff about Jesus's death and resurrection? Why don't we have any examples of Q? It eliminates Q completely. But now we have to grapple with the question of, if Luke did know Matthew, then why did he feel that he had the right to completely contradict Matthew in places, completely overwrite Matthew, come up with a completely different story, a completely different explanation for historical events that he had evidence of? Is it because he had contradictory materials and he felt that his materials were better than Matthew's? We have no idea, but I think that's pretty hard to swallow. What I like about the four-source hypothesis is that nobody is intentionally overwriting somebody else. Nobody is intentionally, contradicting anybody else. They're all doing the best they can with the sources that they have access to. Whereas this one requires that we figure out why Luke would have directly contradicted Matthew. But it's possible to overcome that. You could say that he had a different message to share, and so he just completely ignored some material and found other sources of information to fill in those gaps in a different way, from different traditions about Jesus' life. So these are two kind of competing hypotheses that are out there that different scholars will kind of debate and go back and forth. And some really like one and some really like the other. Like I said, the four-source hypothesis is the most widely accepted one, but the Farrer hypothesis, ever since 1955, is up there with that one in terms of competitors on this. And like I said, they have to stay hypotheses. We cannot prove any of this. It's impossible. So we just keep on playing back and forth with these things. So questions and comments now that you've got two to kind of compare and contrast.
It makes sense. It makes sense that I think the one with the four sources makes more sense than this one. And it explains similarities, and yet they're not. I just always assumed they were the same story, but now that you pointed it out, I can see that there are real differences in those stories. Yeah.
I kind of like the Farrer hypothesis because of not having anything from Q anywhere makes me a little skeptical. And the Farrer hypothesis also shows why Matthew and Luke had so many things that were exactly the same, because Luke got it from Matthew.
Right.
So, and the other thing, sometimes and I don't know, I guess they have to remember a lot or talk with people and know, but one person can have two different ways of hearing a story. And Luke could have gone one route away from the way Matthew did.
Yeah.
So
He could have.
anyway.
Yeah.
my
I mean,
humble
they're
opinion.
both just as, you can't prove one or the other. So everybody kind of has to choose what they like best. But I do have one more theory to share with you before you make your final decision.
Okay.
This one doesn't really have a name yet, because it's it's interesting because it's really, really old, but it's also very new. So this is based on what the early church leaders, the early church fathers, believed and espoused for several hundred years, before scholarship of more of the scientific method, skeptical kind, came around in like the 19th century. So the early church fathers believed that Matthew was the first gospel that was written. And that's why in our Bible, Matthew comes first in the New Testament. And they very strongly believe this. To the point that when you look at where a lot of those early theologians were pulling their quotes from the Gospels, the vast majority of the quotes that they pull are from the Gospel of Matthew, followed by John, which is a completely different kind of experience. And then after that, a distant third is Mark. And so modern scholars have started asking some questions. How come the early church so heavily favored the idea that Matthew was written first? But just because we have these problems with the idea of Matthew being written first, logically, we reject that. And so modern adherents to this theory about, that the church fathers kind of started, suggest that we think about this a little bit more closely. And so they've developed a new theory that starts, interestingly, with what they're calling the Proto-Matthew. And Proto-Matthew was written in Hebrew. Now, again, we have no evidence, we have no historical documents that have any fragments or anything from this Proto-Matthew writing. So this is completely theoretical. But their suggestion is that if you start with Proto-Matthew, if you have a Hebrew source of the Gospel of Matthew, it doesn't look exactly like the Greek version. It's not just a straight translation, but it's got a lot of, the main components of Matthew. If you start there, and that comes first, then you can say, okay, well then Proto-Matthew was taken and translated into Greek and modified to fit an audience that would have been reading in Greek. Simultaneously, Mark, the author Mark, took that Proto-Matthew, translated it into his own Greek, but condensed it, took out the stuff that he didn't think was important, which is why Mark's gospel is much shorter and missing a lot of the elements of Matthew. And then Luke, they don't really care so much about Luke, because what they're trying to do is get Matthew back to the priority, get Matthew back to being the first one that was written. So if Matthew is first, then Mark is a condensing of the original gospel. And then Luke maybe only had Mark and his own sources, or maybe had Matthew and decided to to change some things up because of his own choices and things like that. Kind of back to, the Farrer versus four source hypothesis thing. But what's important for these people is the idea that Matthew came first. And so this is a whole fairly new. This was just kind of becoming of interest to scholars right as I was getting ready to leave seminary. So I learned the four source hypothesis as basically like the rule. And then as I was getting ready to leave seminary, which was 10 years ago, 11 years ago, that was when that's when this started to kind of get into the whispers of the students and the scholars at the school. So that's kind of how new this theory is. But it's also old because it's based on that idea that the early church tradition heavily favors Matthew as being written first. So those are our three theories. Questions or comments on those?
Yeah, I mean, that one makes sense to me too. Even more confused.
So I think, what I don't want you to feel like you have to choose one of these. It's not, critical, but what I want you to be, I think what I want you to take away from this is that when we look at these gospels, we don't have, like, when you open up your Bible and it's one of those study Bibles and it has the cute little paragraph or a couple of pages at the beginning of each book that tells you about the author and the context and the time periods and all these different things. That stuff is all extrapolated out from reading the text itself, from looking at the historical context, potential historical context, from comparing what's in the book to what's outside of the book, to from looking at manuscripts that are really old, or even fragments of manuscripts that are really old, to see what we can glean from the aging of those manuscripts, or from the comparing the types of language and verbs and nouns and or grammars that are used, and comparing that to other Greek or Hebrew writings, and seeing if we can figure out the timing to because they're similar, and all these different things that scholars are doing in the background that end up in that nice little condensed paragraph for you. It's not that somehow we just magically know this stuff. Scholars have to figure this stuff out, and it's all conjecture. It's all just kind of trying to use the evidence. It's like crime scene investigation. If you ever watch any of those criminal procedural shows,
Yeah.
It's basically the same thing. The author is dead. The audience is long dead. We don't even have the original copy of the writing. We just have later copies of the writing. And so how do we figure out where this came from? Just by looking at the text itself. And all of this stuff comes from that. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind, when we're reading the Gospels and anything in the Bible. All right. So are we ready to move on to looking at each individual book itself?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Okay. So when we talk about the Gospels, often we'll say the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of John, and that is a misnomer. I think it's important for us to, even though it doesn't flow off the tongue as easily, the titles that we now have for the Gospels in Greek, the Greek what's the word, preposition that we have for the titles of these Gospels is according to. And so for example, the Gospel of Mark, in the manuscripts that we have that have titles, it says para Markon, which is according to Mark. So we should call them the Gospel according to Mark, which we do, like on Sunday mornings when
Yes.
read, we say the Gospel according to Saint Matthew, the 4th chapter, and that is that's the title of that book. At least it is now. But you should also know that if we were being honest, all of the Gospels would be the Gospel according to Anonymous. None of the Gospels claim authorship in and of themselves within the text itself. So in, like, for example, Paul's letters, what you read at the very beginning of all of Paul's letters is Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, blah, 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 to the churches of blah, blah, blah place. Grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. That's how you wrote a letter then. Today, we don't put who the letter is from until the bottom. But back then, the very first thing that you did was tell them who was writing to them. And so we have that in the letters from Paul, but we do not have that here. These were not letters, or at least not letters that were claimed by the author, at least not in any of the manuscripts that we have access to. And the earliest titles, these paramarkons type of things, the earliest titles don't start appearing in manuscripts until about 200 AD. So more than 100 years after they were written, close to 200 years after the life of Jesus, and is when we started to actually see these titles. So these stories, these books were originally written without titles, and they were originally written anonymously, or at least the manuscripts that we have now are anonymous. They don't have any indication of who wrote them. And so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the names that we use because of those traditions from the 200s on. But they are also need to be accepted not as, you know, the official names of the people who wrote these things, but as just kind of the short version, the easy way to refer to them, so everybody knows what you're talking about. But so it's not necessarily that the gospel according to Matthew was written by a person named Matthew. There's no evidence of that. There's no proof of that in the text itself. But we call it Matthew because that makes it easy for me to say, oh yeah, I'm talking about the gospel according to Matthew, and then you all know what I'm talking about. It's a
Wow, I never knew that.
yes.
Yeah, it makes two of us.
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
So the New Testament has 27 books, and 6 of them are unattributed within the text themselves. And those 6 are Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and Hebrews. All the rest of them claim authorship within the text themselves, but these do not. So we do, though, have the historical, tradition around the authorship and who these people were. So I want to share those with you because, just like all of this stuff I'm telling you is theoretical. They're all hypotheses. They're all our extrapolations out from the text, trying to figure out, what is true or what could be true. Because we can't prove any of this, we also can't technically prove that the traditional ascriptions are false either. So Matthew is traditionally understood to be the Greek name of the tax collector Levi, who appears in the Gospel of Matthew as one of the 12 disciples. I will tell you that I personally don't really care if the person who wrote that was named Matthew or not. It doesn't matter to me. I think that it's very unlikely, highly unlikely, like I said, that Levi, the tax collector who appears in the narrative, actually wrote it, because if he did, then he was probably 100 years old when he wrote it down. But I can't say that is, blatantly false. I cannot prove to you that it was not this person any more than I can prove to you that it was. And so, anybody who wants to kind of stick with these traditional ideas, that's fine. You are entitled to that just as much as I'm entitled to say, no, I don't think that this is right. But I want to share with you, the possibilities and why I fall where I fall with it. But anyway, back to this. So Matthew, tax collector, in the text, he's called Levi. He's one of the 12 disciples. Mark is mentioned in the book of Acts as a follower of Peter. He is understood to be one of the 70 apostles that Jesus sent out into the countryside in Luke chapter 10. So that's where we get his name and his connection to Jesus. Luke is traditionally understood to be a doctor because his writing is very formal and educated. And he wrote his gospel is actually at least pseudo letterish, because there's no author listed, but there is an audience. There is an addressee listed, and we're going to look at that later. And Luke actually wrote the longest and most expanded version of a gospel, because his gospel, Luke, is actually continued in the book of Acts. The same person wrote Luke and Acts. And the reason we know that is because at the beginning of Luke, we have him talking to his audience, a man named Theophilus. And then in Acts, he says, in my previous writing to you, dear Theophilus, I told you about the life of Jesus. Now I'm going to tell you what happened next in the early church. And so both of those are kind of a 2-volume set. Luke and Acts go together. And Luke is seen to considered to be a close friend of Paul, like the Saul Paul guy. That's where he comes from. And then John, he's my favorite one. He's really interesting. So John is considered to be one of Jesus' disciples. Within the Gospel of John, there's this very strange ongoing image that is a description that is used of the one whom Jesus loved, the disciple whom Jesus loved. And that appears a lot. And a lot of scholars have studied this and tried to figure out, who this is referring to. And within the text itself, the writer claims that I, the person writing this, am the disciple that Jesus loved. And if this is John, the disciple that is listed within the lists of the 12 disciples of Jesus, then historically he would need to be considered the youngest disciple, because he lived for a really long time, if we are to believe that he wrote not only the Gospel of John, but also the 3 letters of John and the book of Revelation. So he was, 130, 140 years old when he wrote the book of Revelation, if this is the same guy who walked the earth with Jesus.
Is he the one that when Jesus was on the cross, he said that Mary would be his mother? And okay.
Yes. So that's the author himself, kind of putting himself in that position. So I think what I want to emphasize here, again, we can't prove that this stuff is not true. But when we look at the historicity, or not the historicity, the context, the potential dating of these writings, I feel that it is very unlikely that these people who, were contemporaries of Jesus could possibly be the ones who actually wrote this stuff. But even if the facts aren't totally accurate, even if the traditions of who wrote this stuff isn't completely accurate, I think that listening to stories tells us important things about the author, his intention, his audience, his context. And I think if we can kind of let go of this stuff, if we can allow it to be a question mark that isn't necessarily critical to our understanding, then I think it opens up a whole new world of interpretation for us. And I've said that before, for example, with like the Old Testament. Doesn't matter if there was an actual man named Noah who actually built an ark with actual animals in it. Or if we kind of suspend that disbelief, if we suspend that question and we say, well, if it's not, why is it in the Bible? What can we get out of it, even if it's just a story? Because there's no such thing as just a story. Stories tell us important things. They answer important questions. Who are we? Where do we come from? What is our purpose in this world? And I think if we're not so busy trying to look for historical facts and proofs and historicity, I think we can open ourselves up to what's really important, which is, who is God? Who are we? What is our purpose in the world? And so I am encouraging you, I'm inviting you to do that with me when we look at the Gospels as well. All right, pause spot. Questions, comments? Nothing? Oh, Karen.
Well, so we don't know which one of them talked first, and or wrote first, but it doesn't really matter.
Not really. I'm gonna run you down what I think, but I can't prove any of this any more than anybody else can prove their position.
You know, Katie, this is all so fascinating to me. And when I was reading the title of today's lesson, I thought, wow, what can she say about that? And there's so much going on here. I'm really appreciating all this. Thank you.
There's a lot to say, actually.
Yes, there sure is.
All right. Well, let's take a look at our first buddy here, Mark. And I'm starting with Mark because, like I said, I ascribe to the four source hypothesis. I do not believe that Matthew was first. There could be a proto-Matthew written in Hebrew. I don't know. But I'm going to just go with the kind of, most widely accepted theory and say that Mark was written first. So Mark has the most, I'm going to call it rough. He has the most rough gospel. He's missing a lot of the important story points that we today kind of buy into and kind of cobble together when we look at all four gospels together and kind of create the one smooth narrative in our minds. Mark is missing a lot of it. Like I said before, Mark does not have a nativity. He starts with the baptism of Jesus and moves forward from there. He has no post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. He has no post-resurrection explanations of what happened or why. He just doesn't seem interested in any of that. Additionally, his writing itself is very rough, is very coarse. His Greek is not very grammatically smooth. He clearly is not a native Greek speaker or writer. He's obviously got some kind of education because he can write in Greek, but it's not fluid. It's not educated. It's not an educated level. It's not an acceptable. It's not something that would be accepted in an academy somewhere. It's more kind of the vulgar vernacular of the time. So kind of, who is this guy if he's got this very coarse Greek? Mark has a heavy emphasis on what scholars call the messianic secret. Jesus in his story is constantly telling people not to tell who he is. When he vanquishes a demon and the demon says, "I know who you are, you're the Son of God," Jesus shushes him. When Jesus performs a miracle on someone and someone says, "Oh, you are the Son of God," he says, "Shh, don't tell anyone." Why? Why is that? Why is that important? Very interesting question. Another thing that Mark has going on is there is this pressure, this time pressure. His transitions from story to story, frequently the transition is immediately. Jesus was, hanging out with his friends and healing some people. And then we get a new paragraph. Immediately, he got in a boat and headed across the Sea of Galilee. Immediately, he, headed to this new town. There is this urging, this pressure, this constant forward motion that you get when you read the Gospel of Mark in sequence, when you read the entire thing all at once, that it's pressing forward toward the end of the story, toward the death and resurrection of Jesus. Everything is immediately. And Mark's gospel, like I said, is written in Greek, but it's in coarse Greek. It seems to be written for a Gentile audience. Some scholars place him in Rome or maybe Antioch. I think that Antioch maybe is a little bit more likely because of the very coarse Greek. Antioch is still a major city, but it's not in the central, the center of Rome, of course, in Rome, you could still have people who were from out of town that weren't, native Greek speakers. But Mark 2 is possibly, I said before, possibly one of the first, or maybe even the first person to take all of these different traditions and sayings of Jesus, all of these stories about Jesus' life, all of these legends about Jesus, and create a single narrative that points to an overall theological meaning. And he is not writing for historical accuracy. That's not his goal. His goal is to share this story of who Jesus is and to kind of prove his authority by setting the core of the gospel, which is the death and resurrection, within this larger narrative. And so when you look at Mark kind of as a whole, you see that we start with authoritative deeds, miracles. The first half of Mark is all about the miracles of Jesus. And then at about chapter 8, verse 31, there's a pretty strict break that most of the miracles that Jesus performs happen before that. And so there's this transition from the authoritative deeds of Jesus into the authoritative words of Jesus. And so Mark is trying to make a point here. Look at what this guy can do. He can perform miracles. He's got some authority. Now that you know that he has authority, I'm going to talk to you about what he said. His words have authority, and you know that because he has these abilities. And then from the words, then we have the transition into the passion narrative. And so if this guy has the ability to do these deeds and he has these authoritative words, he could combine those together and avoid everything that's coming. Why doesn't he do that? Because there is authority in the death itself. There's authority in that experience of the passion itself. And so there is something about this. There is good news to be found within this story of the passion. And so that's kind of what Mark is all about. But sorry, go ahead, Jim.
When you're making these comments about that it's a coarse Greek, are you reading the Bible that was written in Greek? Or what version are you reading all of this from? Because each version to me seems like it's different.
Yeah. So the versions of the New Testament that we have in Greek today, either the one that is based on well, there are a couple of different ones that kind of float around, but that is, so scholars take all of the different possible manuscripts we've got. We have manuscripts that are older, we have manuscripts that are newer, we have fragments of manuscripts, we have one piece of papyrus that is frayed at the edges that has like one chapter or part of a chapter on it. And they take all of that stuff and they put it together and they compare it and contrast it and they come up with what they think is the most accurate possible version that is still legible, still makes some kind of sense when you read it, so that it's not skipping words and jumbling all over the place and grammatically completely ununderstandable. And so that's how they come up with the books that we are able to buy today that are the Greek New Testament. But when we say coarse Greek, when we look at the earliest manuscripts we have of Mark, the Greek is very vulgar. The grammar is not great. It's like when you meet someone who is from a foreign country, especially one that doesn't have any similarities in their grammar to English. So someone from like China or Pakistan or another country that has a completely different alphabet, completely different grammatical system from English. You can understand what they're saying, but their grammar is not fluid and perfect in terms of the rules that we have in English, because they didn't grow up that way, and they're still trying to figure out how everything fits together. For example, this is a perfect example. I had a lot of Korean friends when I was in seminary, because Korea has a huge Presbyterian population, and I went to a Presbyterian seminary. And my friends would ask me, do you want to go watch a movie? And I said, sure, that sounds good. And they said, okay, well, we'll meet out by our cars at 7, and we'll go watch a movie. And I was very confused by this over time, until I realized that when someone says watch a movie, my assumption is that we're doing it on a television in somebody's room. If we're going to see something at the cinema, we say go to a movie. Do you two have the same? Are you three have the same kind of assumption?
Yes.
So I didn't even know I had that assumption until I encountered had a completely different use of that. And so there are all these intricacies of our language that we don't even know we have, that when someone who doesn't have that because they didn't grow up with it writes or speaks, you don't realize that you have it until it's not there. And so it's kind of the same thing here, that someone who's really good at reading this kind of middle Greek from this period, from this early Roman period, can read it and can see when someone is using the correct grammar and complicated sentence structure that is an indicator of high education, versus someone who is a second language person and is just kind of trying to communicate as best they can. And that's Mark. Mark is not flowery and flowy. His sentence structures are very simple, that kind of thing.
Great.
Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Great. So I put up here for each of these, I wanted to pick out something that would kind of give us some aspect. We obviously can't read all of these. It would be awesome if we could just read the entirety of Mark in one sitting and then talk about all of these different elements after having experienced it. But unfortunately, we can't do that for each of these. But I wanted to show you for Mark, because we talked about how these books don't have titles, and they were added later. But for Mark, that's actually not true, because for Mark, the title is the first sentence. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then he starts his gospel, like I said, with the baptism of Jesus. So John the Baptizer appeared in the wilderness proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. So there's no nativity in Mark's gospel. So Mark, it was written sometime between the year 70 and 75 AD. We know this because of the apocalyptic discourse that appears in Mark chapter 13. What Jesus is talking about in that discourse are events that happened within the context of the first Jewish-Roman War, which took place from 66 to 74 AD. So again, the way that we read our Bible, the assumptions that we make about where the Bible comes from matters here, because some people would say that it doesn't matter that Jesus, told us what was happening in the year 70, even though he was, talking in the year 30, because Jesus knows everything. And so he was able to make these accurate predictions. That's what they believe prophecy is. But we've talked before in this class about how prophecy can be understood not as foretelling, not as fortune telling, not as telling what the future is going to hold, but as forthtelling, as explaining things that are currently happening to help people understand why they're happening, and to help them to place themselves and what they believe and who they are within the context of those events. And so if Mark was writing around the year 70, 71, 72. And he included this story about Jesus explaining why the temple was going to be destroyed. Now he is helping people to place their own historical events that are, contemporary, happening to them right then, within the context of this good news of Jesus Christ. And so very different understandings of, how we read and how we engage with these, especially these, prophetic sections. But if if you're a scholar who believes in that apocalyptic writing style and why it's important and why it was used, then you can very clearly place Mark right after the destruction of the temple, which happened in the year 70. And so that's why they place this in that year. So if we know all of these things based on the text itself, what are some things that we can deduce about this person that we call Mark? Now, like I said, we have no way of knowing if this person was called Mark or not, but we'll call him Mark for the sake of expediency. So what we can deduce is that Mark was a Christian who was living in a Greek city, and he was not a Greek speaker traditionally. He was probably Jewish. And he was looking to establish the authority of Jesus by placing the teachings and the death and resurrection of Jesus within the wider narrative of his career. And why was he doing this? Why would that be important? Possibly because he was trying to reach people who were Hellenistic Jews, or Hellenistic Gentiles, who didn't have that connection to Judaism. Possibly he was trying to connect to his fellow Jews, trying to help them to understand how Jesus fits into their worldview, their experience as Jews. Or perhaps he was, kind of trying to do a mix of things there, either in Antioch or Rome, possibly, based on some of the theories. So that's what Mark's got going on. Any questions about?
Yeah, you said he's probably Jewish, but then you say a Christian living in a Greek city. So how do you mean that?
So when we talk about Jews and Christians at this time, we have to remember that Judaism and Christianity are not two separate religions.
Okay.
You can be a Christian Jew, you can be a Christian Greek, you can, a Christian pagan. You can't be a pagan Jew. That's not a thing. Okay. But Christianity is in some places a sect of Judaism, and in other places is spreading like wildfire among the Greeks, among the Gentiles, outside of the Jewish realm of things.
Okay.
In some places, you have people who are members of the synagogue who have kind of added Jesus on to their Jewish faith and are trying to convince other members of the synagogue to get on board. In other places, you have, the synagogue has completely rejected this idea about Jesus. And so the missionary, like Paul would go then to the Gentiles and start to, talk to them about Jesus and form the church around the Greeks. So Mark is likely a Jewish Christian who is living in the diaspora. He doesn't live in Palestine. He doesn't live in Galilee or Jerusalem or Jericho or any of those places. He lives outside of that region, maybe in Syria, in Antioch, or maybe in Rome. There are the two possible places that a lot of people try to place him. So that's what I mean.
Thank you.
Any other questions
Thank you.
or comments about Mark? Okay, let's move on to Matthew. So Matthew, when you read his gospel, he has a heavy emphasis on the Jewish roots of Christianity. I didn't look up the exact numbers, but when you look at the gospels, all of the gospels, and you find all of the different references, quotes from scripture, from their Hebrew scriptures, Matthew by far has the most quotations from the Hebrew scriptures. And the reason for this is because he is incredibly interested in proving that Jesus is the fulfillment of Jewish prophecies. That what Jesus is the continuation of what God has been doing among the Jews for generations. And so, for example, in Matthew's genealogy, at the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, the genealogy starts from Abraham. This guy is connected to the Jewish people to such a degree that we can follow his genealogy all the way back to the very founder of the people of Israel, Abraham, when God called Abraham. And we follow that all the way up through Joseph, who is sort of the father of Jesus. So he's very interested in Jewish continuity. We talked about how Mark is written in a very coarse Greek. Matthew is written in what scholars call like a synagogue Greek. So it's still written in Greek, but it's has a Semitic flavor to it. It's very polished Greek, but it has a lot of Semitic impulses, I guess you could say. And that's why when we think about like that last source criticism hypothesis, that's why scholars can say, well, maybe it was originally Hebrew and then they translated it into Greek, and that's why it has such a Hebrew flavor to it, because it was originally written in Hebrew and they were translating it in the same way that, for example, when I was taking German, and Germans are famous for their run-on sentences and very complex grammar, when you translate German into English, it's really difficult to not allow that very complex run-on sentence kind of thing to remain, even though you're writing in English and it makes sense in English. When you're translating, you're kind of trying to make it as close to the original as you can. And so you end up with these run-on sentences that mirror the German. Whereas if you're translating another kind of language, you don't get that as much. And so the original language that something is written in is going to have an impact on the translation that you make. And this synagogue Greek shows that there's a heavy connection to Judaism, to the Hebrew, if not the Hebrew language, then at least the Hebrew culture. Matthew is very interested in the divinity of Jesus, because believing in the divinity of Jesus is what differentiates Christians from Jews. For Matthew, a Jew is someone who adheres to the Hebrew scriptures and the Hebrew understanding, the Israelite understanding of who God is in that relationship. And all Jesus is the next step. But if you don't take that next step, then you remain just a Jew and not a Christian. And he's trying to bring people who are Jewish to an understanding that, yes, Jesus is divine. Yes, Jesus is part of God's plan that we've already seen unraveling for the last several hundred, if not several thousand years of Jewish history. So that's what he's attempting to do. He also, very interestingly, writes in the Greek. His writing is in the historic present tense. So we don't, well, I mean, I guess we kind of have that. Like when we tell a story in the present tense, typically it can be like a fairy tale or a children's story. Goldilocks is walking through the forest and she comes across a little house, and she goes into the house and she sees porridge sitting on the table, and she says, "Oh, this porridge is too hot. Oh, this porridge is too cold." Mm-hmm. And so then she goes into the next room. So I'm telling you this in the present tense. I'm using present tense verbs, but you understand that this is not happening right now. But the reason why Matthew writes using the historic present tense in his Greek is because when you use the present tense to talk about a historical event or to talk about, tell a story that has already taken place, it reminds the people who are listening that even though the events are in the past, they have implications for today. That this has to do with you. This has to do with what you are going through. You need to connect to this. And so Matthew is trying to convince his listeners that that what happened with Jesus changes the Jewish understanding of God, that everything is different now, not because Jesus has shoved aside Judaism, but because Jesus has fulfilled the law. And so we need to follow God where God is taking us. So the passage that I picked up from Matthew to kind of give you an example of some of this is Matthew chapter 21, verses 6-7. This is within the story of the Palm Sunday story that we read, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And this is kind of funny. My college professor in Christian religion one day asked us if there's any physical description of Jesus in the Bible. And we all said, no, I don't think so. I haven't ever come across anything like that. And he said, there is one place where the Bible describes Jesus physically, and it's not direct, but you can figure it out. If you go to Matthew chapter 21, verses 6-7 says, the disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and he sat on them. It took 2 animals to carry Jesus. He must have been really fat. But it's a joke, obviously. But the reason why Matthew goes to great pains to make sure that it's the donkey and the colt is because the psalm that Matthew is referring to here talks about a donkey and a colt. A psalm is, of course, a poem. And like in a lot of poetry, there's a lot of parallelism, kind of repeating the same thing but slightly different. And so in this, I should have put it in the presentation to show you, but in this couple of lines of poetry that he pulls from the Psalms, it talks about how the king is riding in on a donkey. He is coming in his glory on the colt, the foal of the donkey. And so these 2 lines together are supposed to just be, flowery poetic language. But this Matthew person, this writer, is so interested in proving to us that Jesus is the literal fulfillment of Scripture, that he says, look, even this poem says there's a donkey and a colt, and look, in the story, Jesus didn't have just a donkey, he also had the colt. Both of them were there. He sat on both of them because that's what the Scripture says literally happened. And so these are the pains to which this person goes to make sure that his audience understands how deeply connected Jesus is to the Hebrew Scriptures, to the fulfillment of those prophecies, to the continuity of what God has been doing through and with the people of Israel from the beginning. So scholars think that Matthew was written somewhere between 80 and 90. So, Mark was done around by around 75. And so sometime in the next 5 to 10 years ish, Matthew started to come around. And Matthew is, based on all this information, we can say some things about Matthew. He's an educated Jew. He has a better writing style in the Greek than Mark does. He is likely living in the diaspora. He doesn't live in Palestine. Possibly he is from Alexandria. And the reason for that is because when he quotes the Hebrew Scriptures, he isn't quoting from the Hebrew. He's not translating from the Hebrew Scripture directly into the Greek for his writing. He's actually using the Septuagint, which I think we talked about with the question about where does the Bible come from. The Septuagint was a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures that was translated in Alexandria several hundred years before this time. And so the Alexandrian Jews who didn't know Hebrew, or were marginally associated with Hebrew, would have used the Septuagint as their primary source for their scriptural study. And so it's interesting that this connection is there, because additionally, within Matthew's nativity story, that is where the escape to Egypt takes place. That when Herod attacks all of the babies and toddlers in Bethlehem, they escape to Egypt. And Alexandria would have made sense as a place for them to go if they went to Egypt, because they had a huge Jewish population there. And so is Matthew making a connection with his own community for Jesus by including this detail in the story, that Jesus himself as a baby came to our community. We sheltered him, we housed him, we kept him safe from Herod, who was trying to kill him, until it was time for his family to return to Palestine. So interesting, possible connection there. So I kind of like that. But Matthew is concerned about Christianity losing its Jewish roots. He's seeing that the Jews are not accepting this good news about Jesus. And so he's trying to convince the Jews of Jesus's legitimacy for their faith tradition. His audience is very, very likely Jewish, and Matthew is trying to convince them that Jesus fits with them. Within the Gospel of Matthew, especially compared to Luke and John, there is not nearly as much of an emphasis on blaming the Jews for the crucifixion in Matthew as there is in Luke and John. And that makes sense. If you're trying to convince Jews to get on board, you don't want to make them angry by placing the blame for this guy's death at their feet. So when you read the Passion narrative in Matthew, you see a much less emphasis on the Jewish role there than you do in Luke, and especially John. John is really bad. So, questions and comments on Matthew? Oh, wow, I got to pick up the pace. Sorry, everybody. I'm talking a whole lot. It's late. All right, so let's move on to Luke. So Luke, like I said, is has an interesting framework, because he's the only gospel that has a direct address. He writes to a person named Theophilus, and we don't know if this is a real person. If he is a real person, then he's probably some kind of aristocrat. Maybe he is the patron who commissioned Luke to write this gospel. Or it's possible, because Theophilus means lover of God. And so it's possible that Theophilus is not a real person, but that Luke is writing to a generic Gentile who believes in God, and he is trying to convince them to become a Christian. So they believe in the Jewish God, but they are Gentiles. They are Greeks. They're not Hebrew, but they believe in God. And so it would be kind of like me writing an email out to all of you and saying, "Dear Zoom Bible studiers," I'm talking to or "Dear Zoom Bible studier," I guess. I'm talking to a generic person who is engaged in this particular thing. So it's written to several different people, but I'm referring to you not by your name, but by your identity that matters for this particular communication. And Theophilus, so to us, sounds like it could be a name, but it also, because it means lover of God, it could be, "Dear lover of God, I am writing this to you today because I know that you believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, even though you are not of Jewish descent. And I want to tell you about what that God is doing right now in and through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So it could be that. And we don't really, we can't really know either way. So we've got that going on. In terms of his writing, Luke seems to be intentionally copying the style of that Septuagint I was telling you about before. Is it possible, if he is not writing to an individual person, but to a wider audience, is it possible that he is writing to expand the scriptures? His thought is that he will write this and then it will be eventually included in the document of the Bible. So we'll have, the Hebrew scriptures, and then we'll have this Luke and Acts book that kind of gets tacked onto the end. And it makes sense because it's already written in Greek and it already, fits together stylistically. I copied the kind of style of this Septuagint book, so it fits into the idea of the scriptures. So we have that. Luke is heavily interested in the role of the Spirit in the life of Jesus and in the life of the church when he gets to Acts. And he's heavily interested in placing Jesus within God's wider salvation history. So Luke has reference to the ancestors. He references, in his genealogy, he doesn't go back just to Abraham, he goes back all the way to Adam. So Jesus is connected to not just the Jews, but to all people through the first man. And then he's got, the time of Jesus, and then he's got the period of the church that he talks about. So he has kind of these three stages in salvation history that he refers to or gives us a lot of information about. But he's also interested in doing something, in navigating the political realities of our world, like the Roman Empire, and helping people to figure out how to engage with that. Loyalty to Rome is contrary to our loyalty to God. And then he also seems to be suggesting that the mission of the church is a replacement of the mission of the Jews as God's people, because the Jews have rejected Jesus. They've rejected his message. And so God has moved on. God has chosen a new people. And that is these Hellenistic Greeks, Hellenistic Gentiles who are buying into this, this good news about Jesus. Luke is also interesting because of his heavier emphasis on social justice, really, when you look at it. Instead of tracing Jesus's genealogy from Joseph backwards, he traces it to Mary. So Matthew's gospel, his genealogy goes from Abraham to Joseph, but Luke's gospel goes from Adam to Mary. He connects Jesus to Mary. Luke's gospel has many, many more references to women in the stories than any of the others. And there are even little places that kind of give you the sense of it. I didn't put this in the slides, but for example, in the Beatitudes, in Luke's gospel, Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor." In Matthew's gospel, Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." So Luke is, pretty just out there. People who are poor, women, people who are marginalized, people who are vulnerable, are the people that this is about. Whereas Matthew goes in a different direction. He doesn't heavily emphasize that as much. And it makes sense too, because within a Jewish tradition, within Gentiles too would be excluded. They would be vulnerable. They would be on the margins. And so Luke's gospel has the Magnificat, the Song of Mary, where she talks about casting the mighty down from their thrones and lifting the humble of heart, and feeding the hungry and sheltering the homeless and all these kinds of things. The literal just physical justice of Jesus' message is most heavily emphasized in the Gospel of Luke. And then here is a shortened version of the thing with Theophilus I was telling you about. Verses 1-4 say, "Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those from whom the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too, after investigating everything carefully from the first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed." So he is writing to this Theophilus, whether that's an individual person or to just someone who loves God, to convince them of what it is that is going on with this Jesus guy and his focus on mission and the role of the Spirit and the importance of connecting with marginalized persons and lifting them up. Luke is estimated to have been written around 95, so a little bit after Matthew. But if we're going with the four-source hypothesis, he did not know of Matthew. Matthew was maybe just not widely circulated at that point yet, or he was just from a completely different community, and so Matthew's gospel was not really applicable to his particular kind of community. So with all of this stuff, what can we say about Luke? Well, he wasn't an educated person. He probably comes from an urban area. He had a lot of money. So the doctor attribution isn't too far from the truth, perhaps. Most of his peers would have also been well-educated people of means. But unlike his peers, unlike others who wrote at the same time, he had respect for the artisans and the small business people who made up a lot of the early church groups that were founded by people like Paul. When Paul came into town, Paul was a tent maker, and so he would hang out with the artisans, he would hang out with the small business owners, and that's where he would found his churches. But that doesn't mean that he didn't have rich people and poor people and all that in there, but that was kind of the main focus of his church growing. And Luke respected those people, and he heavily emphasized the humanity of the poor within his writing, which is very different than a lot of people who were his contemporary writers. We talked a lot about the synoptic gospels, those Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and how they're very connected and have a lot of similarities. But there are some interesting parallels between Luke and John that they don't share with Matthew and Mark. So Matthew and Mark are missing, like I said, that heavy criticism of the Jews. Matthew, I think intentionally, because he's trying to convince Jews to accept Christ. Only Luke and John refer to Jesus's friends, Mary and Martha. Matthew and Mark do not have any reference to them. Just one tiny little detail, but in Luke and John, it's the detail that the servant's right ear is cut off in the Garden of Gethsemane. Its right ear appears in both of those, but does not appear with those details in Matthew and Mark. Now, of course, there are only 2 ears to pick from, so it's possible that John and Luke just kind of both chose the same one by chance. But there are just these little details like that seem to potentially connect Luke more to the same community as John, and more to the same source material and tradition material than Matthew and Mark had. So there might be some kind of connection there that scholars have not pursued, or maybe can't pursue, because like I said, John is so different from the others. So questions about Luke or comments?
I've always liked the Luke gospel better than the others.
Hmm.
And I realized when you said that, it's because he talks about women
Mhm.
and the poor people, that uh, I don't know. I like him the best,
Yeah, Luke is
or
known as
whoever it was.
Luke is known as the social justice gospel writer, evangelist.
Yeah, that's why it speaks to me better than the other ones, I think.
Mhm. All right, so let's move on to John. John is not all that out there when you compare him to some of the other gospels that we have access to that did not make it into our Bible. But he is the wildest of all of the gospels that we have within our holy scriptures. He has wildly different stories from the others. There's no upper room. There's no Passover. He adds in the story of the raising of Lazarus that does not appear at all in any of the other ones. He has different discourses, different long speeches from Jesus that don't appear in any way in the others. So they're just very, very different. The Greek that John uses and the theology that John uses are very sophisticated and complex. He's making some very refined points with his gospel, and he uses a very complex Greek that is harder to translate well for early Greek learners like myself when I was in seminary. Takes a little bit more study to fully be able to translate John well. John's prologue, the beginning of his gospel, doesn't just connect Jesus with Jewish history or even with human history, but with the foundations of creation. In the beginning was the Word. Jesus is the Logos. Jesus is the wisdom of God. John has an interesting emphasis on the individual's relationship with Jesus rather than on the community's relationship with Jesus. It's hard to see this because in English we only have our secondary pronoun is you, whether it's singular or plural. And so in the Gospels we don't see the difference, but in John the yous are singular rather than plural almost all the time. So it's referring to my response to Jesus, not our response. And then John changes the plot, changes the timeline of when things happen within the story itself, for the purpose of making theological points. So, for example, in the stories where they have the Last Supper, we know that that's supposed to be the Passover meal, right? That Passover is happening. So in that story, then, on what day of the week is Passover happening? If we think about the week of the Passion.
Wednesday or Thursday.
Isn't that on Thursday? No.
Thursday, yeah. So
Yeah.
Maundy Thursday for us is
Right.
is the day that the Passover meal took place, and then we celebrate communion on that day to remember the establishment of communion at the Passover. In John's gospel, he shifts the timing, and Passover actually happens on Friday. So Jesus is crucified on Friday. He's crucified on the Passover. And the reason he does that is because he wants to make the theological point that Jesus is the Passover lamb. Jesus is replacing that law. Jesus is making this sacrifice once and for all to expiate the sins of the world. And so he doesn't change the timeline in terms of the, what day of the week things happened, but he shifts how the timeline is connected to other calendars, the Jewish calendar that it's taking place within. And so if you think of it, in terms of like, as time passes, it's a different year, right? On a particular year, Passover happens to fall on a Thursday. On another year, it happens to fall on a Friday. And so if we're thinking historically, for John, this happens in a different year. But but the point is, for John, that he doesn't care about that. It doesn't matter what year this took place in. He's trying to make a point theologically about who Jesus is. And for the others, it's not as important as for John that Jesus be the Passover lamb. John is interested in what the death and resurrection of Jesus accomplishes, which is the same thing as what the Passover lamb accomplishes. Salvation from death. And so he actually has to change the timeline to make that point. So here is here's the example piece that I bring to you today. This is going to feed us into who John is. I absolutely love this passage. So this is the very, very end of the Gospel of John. And I'm going to start with John chapter 21, verse 20. But before this, Jesus is, kind of getting ready to leave. And he tells Peter that he is going to lead the church, but that he is going to die a pretty awful death for the sake of Jesus. And so Peter has just received this news that, he's got to be ready to lay down his life for Jesus. And then it says, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. He was the one who had reclined next to Jesus at the supper and had said, Lord, who is it that is going to betray you? That guy. When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about him? So, Peter had just been told that he was going to die a gruesome death. Lord, what about him? Jesus said to him, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me. So the rumor spread in the community that the disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but he did say, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? This is the disciple who is testifying these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true. But there are also many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. And that's the end of the gospel. So I love this because what's really going on here in this story is Peter just got told he's going to die a terrible death. And then Peter sees this other guy and he says, well, what about him? Is he going to die a terrible death too? And Jesus says, if he doesn't die at all, that's none of your business. And so now that I've written this down in my book, now there's a rumor that's spreading that I won't die, because then the very next thing it says is, who is this beloved disciple? It's the one who is testifying these things and has written them. So I'm the author. I am the beloved disciple. I'm the one that Jesus loves. And I'm telling you this story about how I might live forever. And gosh, now there's this rumor that's swirling around that I might live forever. And where did that come from? I don't know. How could somebody make that up? So I love it. I think that's so funny. So this is though where we get the idea that this John person is, going to be really old, possibly even live forever, possibly not ever die. And so he could be the guy who wrote Revelation, because he can be 130, 140 years old, because there's this rumor possibly that he won't die. He will remain until Jesus comes. So I think that's amusing. I like that part. So John is a little bit later. He's written between 100 and 110 AD. What do we know about John? Well, like I said, he claims, the author claims to be this beloved disciple, the disciple that Jesus loves, whatever that means. The one that, is given to Mary to be his mother, and Mary is given to him, to be the son in Jesus' place. He is familiar with Jewish customs, but does not assume that the audience is. And so John might be a Jew of the diaspora, not living in Palestine, but he is probably not in Alexandria like Matthew possibly is, because the times when John quotes Jewish scripture in Greek, he is either creating his own translations from a different Hebrew Bible, if he reads Hebrew, or he has a different Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, because his quotes don't come from any version that we know of today. We can't find direct, word for word versions of that in any of the Hebrew Bibles in Greek that we know of today. So that's what we know of John. But there's another interesting aspect to this John thing, and that's known as the Johannine Community. We have this connection between the Gospel of John and the letters of John, and then possibly also the book of Revelation. And especially the Gospel of John and these letters have very similar grammatical structures, very similar vocabulary is used, very similar themes appear. And so even though there is no proof of this, again, and a lot of scholars are skeptical of this idea, there is a theory that John, this gospel, came from a community of people who used to be Jewish, but were cast out of the synagogue because of their belief in Jesus Christ. And so they formed their own community to interpret the meaning of the life of Jesus. They have these, this Jewish background, but they have been pushed away. They've been told, no, your belief in Jesus makes you no longer a Jew, and so you are no longer part of our community, and they're pushed out. And that might be why there's so much anti-Semitism in this gospel. The Gospel of John heavily emphasizes the role not just of the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, in the death of Jesus, but the people themselves. This is the gospel where Pilate says, why don't I give you Barabbas? And they say no, or why don't I give you this Jesus? And they say no, we want Barabbas instead. Well, what should I do with Jesus? Crucify him. And Pilate says, I haven't found anything wrong with him. He hasn't done anything wrong. I have no right to, I have no right to crucify him. We want you to crucify him anyway. Who cares? We hate this guy. The people themselves, the Jews themselves, are very heavily blamed for the death of Jesus in the Gospel of John. And if he comes from this community of former Jews who have been cast out, who have been excommunicated, so to speak, that would make a lot of sense. They're pretty angry with the Jews, and they want to differentiate themselves, and they want to, they're kind of creating this understanding of that relationship as incredibly negative, and coming out of this rejection of Jesus in their history and their past. Questions about John or any of them? We've come to the end. All right.
Why do you think he's so different?
So I didn't talk at all about Gnosticism. I didn't want to really get into that today, but John seems to have some level of connection with the early Gnostic community. Gnosticism didn't really start to develop into a formal philosophical movement until the mid 200s. So if anything, he would be kind of a proto-Gnostic But we've got this stuff about logos, we've got this stuff about secret knowledge that
Yeah.
things like that turn into Gnosticism. So it's possible that if John came from some Jewish community that got kicked out because of his belief in Jesus along with the rest of his community, and then connected with some of these people who were thinking about Jesus from the perspective of secret knowledge and philosophy and those kinds of things, then it would have moved in a very different direction. Similar to, like, I grew up with the Reformed hymnals, and so then when I moved over to worship with Lutherans, because it had been so long since we were one, there are a lot of lyrics that are different in the hymns that I knew as a kid, and there are different hymns, but it's just over the course of time as hymns are slowly edited and retranslated from German or whatever, they make different choices, and so what you assume is the words is not what I assumed was the words. And so it's kind of like a similar thing. If there are different communities interpreting the same stories but trying to figure out what they mean, but they're not connected to each other, they can come up with different answers to those questions. And then they emphasize different things in the telling of their story to help people to understand those answers and come up with those same conclusions that they came up with.
Okay.
So that's what I think. So finally coming back around here, gosh, this is probably my longest class ever. We're almost going to hit 2 hours here. So why do the Gospels have different stories about Jesus' life? Well, we've talked about all these different things. There are different authors who are writing in different places at different times to different audiences. They have different intentions. They have different goals with writing. They are interpreting Jesus's life differently, and what's important and what's not important to include in the story. How they organize their writing is going to be different because of the points they're trying to make. So all of those things are in there. But what they do share is a lack of interest in historical integrity. These are not history books. These are not intended to be read as a listing of facts. Instead, they're focusing on answering big questions. Who is this guy? What does his life and death and resurrection mean? How should we respond within our context to this knowledge, this information, this experience? When is he coming back? If he's legitimate, why didn't his own people acknowledge him? The problem of the Jews that, slowly over time, as more Gentiles kind of took over the movement, just kind of fell by the wayside. But all of them are interested in answering the question, why? They don't care so much about what happened. They care about why did it happen? And so they don't have any qualms about modifying some of the what's, some of the details of the story so that they can answer their why questions, which is very challenging for people who live in a modern world where truth in fact are usually considered synonymous. So to wrap up today, I would like to read to you the end of the Gospel of Mark. There are 2 other endings to the Gospel of Mark that will appear in your Bible. So if you go to look at this again later, you have to look only from verses 1 to 8. And if you have a good Bible, then it will, anything after that will tell you that it is probably added on later. But if you don't have a good Bible, then it might just list it as part of the text. So I want to read to you what is considered to be the original ending of the Gospel of Mark. And recall the beginning, the front end, chapter 1, verse 1, is the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. So that's kind of the title, the beginning of the good news. And here's the ending. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone from which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So that's the end of the Gospel of Mark. Now you can see how that kind of can be, a little bit troubling for people. There's a lot of stuff in Mark that's troubling that he doesn't address and doesn't answer the questions that are inevitably going to follow. But if you take the beginning of the good news, not the good news, the beginning of the good news, and you get to this point, they went out and fled the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Well, if they didn't say anything to anyone, then how do we know about this? How does anybody else know about this? So clearly, eventually they answered. They told somebody, because this is just the beginning, and it's our job to continue the story, to take these stories, to take this message and move it forward and add to the story. And so that's why Mark is my favorite gospel. I like Luke too, but Mark is my favorite. We are called into the story. We are called to be part of the writing of the story. So, wow, that was a lot. Sorry, I didn't realize it was going to take me this long to get through all this.
It was a lot.
It's really great. I learned a lot.
Yeah.
What other questions or comments do you have before I let you go and have lunch and go on with your day after 2 hours of listening to me yammer on?
It's just fascinating. I love reading it, And I keep thinking about the book, The Zealot. Did you read that?
Mm-mm.
It's written by a Jewish professor and theologian, and he got a lot of criticism for writing a book about Jesus because he was a Jew. And he goes through, he analyzes, it's like a meta-analysis of historical documents related to the life of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And so he goes through and he says, well, this probably didn't happen like this, and because of the documents that we have,
Mm-hmm.
And then he gets to the end and he says, but nobody's ever been able to disprove the resurrection. And, so all of these other things may be consequential, but we don't have proof of them or this or that. But the resurrection is it, that's the whole point. And so it's really an interesting book to read. And I keep thinking about it as you're talking about these historical things and about the things that people said and did. And you can see how they get mixed up. And
yeah, I think there are only 3 things in the whole Bible that must be historically accurate. Number 1, there was a man who,
right,
named Jesus, who lived. He was born.
right,
Doesn't matter even that if he was born of a virgin, he was just born.
right,
He lived. He was physical flesh and blood, and he was God. Number 2, he died. He physically died. His body was dead.
right.
Number 3, he rose. He physically rose from the dead. Those are the only 3 things that matter. Everything else can be allegory, can be myth, can be legend, can be made up story to tell us something about who we are. But those 3 things have to be true. Otherwise, what we're doing is nothing, like Paul said.
And then if you think back to our lesson on what is resurrection, and you talked about the physical body being transformed.
Mm-hmm.
obviously, you know, that's obvious from just that paragraph right there.
All right. Well, I think I've talked at you enough today. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit about what the religious landscape in Reading looks like. We'll talk about some of the different churches we've got, and I'm going to find us some data about, you know, what kind of religious perspectives people have, and we'll take a look at that next week. I'm sure that I won't have nearly as much to say about that as I did today.
This was
Very good.
good.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for sticking with me for 2 hours. Thanks everybody out there
you.
listening, if you made it all the way to the end.
Very good. Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Katie.
Bye.
Bye.